My late wife's wedding necklace was the only thing of hers I hadn't let go of in 3 years. When it disappeared from my dresser drawer, my own daughter told me she'd sold it for vacation money, BAT. And when I drove down to the pawn shop to buy it back, the man behind the counter looked at me like he'd seen a ghost and said I wasn't going to believe what he'd just found hidden inside it. My name is Walter Brennan. Everybody's called me Walt since I was a boy. I'm 61 years old, and I live in Erie, Pennsylvania, in the same house on Larkspur Lane where I raised my daughter and buried my marriage, in a manner of speaking, 3 years ago. I always figured I knew my daughter about as well as a father can know anybody. I was wrong about that. Here's what happened. Before I get into what happened, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments. I always like knowing who's listening. All right, let's get into it. It was a Sunday morning in early March, and I was standing in my bedroom trying to find something to give my daughter for her birthday, which was coming up that Friday. I remembered a little gold bracelet Louise used to keep tucked in the same drawer as her jewelry box, and I thought Claire might like having something of her mother's to wear. So I opened the top drawer of the old oak dresser. The same dresser Louise and I hauled out of an estate sale on the west side 22 years ago, back when we couldn't afford anything that hadn't already belonged to somebody else. And I reached toward the back corner where the velvet box always sat. My hand found empty wood. I moved a stack of folded scarves out of the way, telling myself it had probably just shifted. Nothing. Pulled the whole drawer out and set it on the mattress and went through every last item in it. Twice. The velvet box wasn't there. Not the little gold bracelet I'd come looking for. The necklace, the one Louise wore nearly every day of her adult life, right up until the morning she died. The one I hadn't let another living soul so much as touch in 3 years. Something in my chest pulled tight in a way I hadn't felt since the hospital corridor outside her room. I stood there telling myself I was overreacting, that I must have moved it myself at some point, and simply forgotten. Because a man's memory does strange things after grief gets its hands on it, and mine had been playing tricks on me plenty already. I checked the closet. I checked the old jewelry armoire out in the hallway that used to be Louise's mother's. I even got down on my knees at 61 years old and patted around under the bed like some kind of fool. Nothing. My phone sat on the nightstand where I'd left it charging. I picked it up and looked at the screen for longer than I needed to before I actually dialed my daughter, because some part of me already suspected I wasn't going to care for whatever answer I was about to get. Before I tell you what Claire said to me, you ought to understand what that necklace actually was, because to a stranger it probably just looked like a small oval gold locket on a thin chain, kind of thing you'd walk past in a display case without a second glance. I gave it to Louise on our 24th wedding anniversary. I'd been saving toward it in secret for 4 months, a little at a time, out of a jar in the garage, until I finally had enough to buy it from a jeweler on Chestnut Street who'd since retired and closed up shop. The day I gave it to her, she cried, standing right there at our kitchen counter, and told me she never wanted to take it off as long as she lived. She meant it too. 2 years after that, when the cancer came, that necklace never once left her neck. Not during the treatments. Not on the worst nights, when she couldn't keep food down and could barely keep her eyes open. Not even on the morning she passed, with her hand still curled loosely near her collarbone, like she was checking. It was still there. After she was gone, Boston couldn't bring myself to hand it off to anybody, not even to our own daughter even though Louise had said once, half joking and half not, that it ought to go to Claire someday. I kept it hidden away in that velvet box because looking at it still felt, some days, like looking at her. Claire was 24 when her mother died. I won't pretend I handled her grief the right way in the years after. I worked longer shifts instead of shorter ones. I let her drift instead of pulling her in close the way I should have. Sometime in those 3 years, she started seeing a fellow named Colton, older than her by a handful of years, drove a truck that cost more than my first house, and talked a big game about some construction outfit he was supposedly about to start up. He never once came around for Sunday dinner without finding something to complain about. The food, the drive, the weather. Claire changed around that man, Tat. She started talking about trips and brand names and things her mother never once cared about in her whole life. She stopped calling just to talk the way she used to when Louise was still alive to talk to. She started asking me for money more often than felt natural, and she'd go quiet and short with me whenever I said no, or even just asked what it was for. I watched all of it happen, little by little, month over month, and I didn't do a blessed thing about it. I told myself she was young. I told myself grief works itself out differently in every person. I told myself Colton was a phase she'd shed once she found her footing. That's on me, every bit of it, but nothing. Not one single piece of it prepared me for what she told me on the phone that Sunday morning. Claire picked up on the 4th ring, sounding half asleep still. I didn't waste any breath on pleasantries. I asked her flat out where her mother's necklace had gone, the one from my drawer, the velvet box, because it wasn't there anymore. There was a pause on her end of the line, the kind of pause that tells a man everything he needs to know before a single word gets said out loud. Then she told me not to be upset, and in the next breath, she told me she'd sold it. I actually had to sit down on the edge of the bed because my legs weren't holding me up the way they should have. I asked her, plain as I could manage, if she understood what she'd just told me, that she'd sold her own mother's necklace. She said it had just been sitting in a drawer doing nothing. She said she and Colton had really wanted to get down to Cancun before his cousin's wedding, and she hadn't had the money for it, and she knew how I got whenever she asked me for anything. I could hear a suitcase zipper going in the background while she said all of this. She was packing while we spoke. I told her that necklace was the last thing her mother ever wore, that she'd died wearing it. Claire said she knew that, and she was sorry, but it wasn't as if her mother was coming back for it. The words landed on me like an open-handed slap, though she never raised her voice once saying them. She said it flat and easy. She said it flat and easy, the way a person talks about a used couch they'd sold on some app on their phone. I asked her where she'd taken it. She told me some pawn shop out on Route 20, something called Founders, and then said she had to finish packing because her flight left at 2. She hung up before I could get another word out. I sat there on the edge of that bed a long while, phone still in my hand, staring at that empty drawer, and I could feel something in my chest shift from plain grief into something colder and a good deal more determined. 28 years of marriage, 3 years of grieving on my own, and somehow it had all come down to one open velvet box sitting empty on the bedspread beside me. I kept picturing Louise's face the day I'd handed her that necklace, the way she cried right there in our kitchen, the way she used to reach up and touch it without even realizing she was doing it, especially near the end. Relatable and husky male tone that. And now some stranger behind a glass counter had it sitting there with a price tag hanging off it, while my own daughter was somewhere packing a suitcase for the beach like none of it meant a thing. I didn't cry that morning. I want to be honest about that, because I've cried plenty since Louise died. But that morning, something in me went still and focused, a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man right before he decides he isn't going to let something go without a fight. I got dressed, got in my truck, and drove out along Route 20 looking for a pawn shop with the word Founders somewhere on the sign. Found it about 15 minutes later. A low brick building with bars across the windows and a sign that had faded down to almost nothing. Founders Pawn and Loan. I walked in, a little bell over the door announcing me, and behind the counter stood a heavy-set man in his 50s with reading glasses shoved up into his hair, a name tag reading Sam. I told him straight out, no small talk, that my daughter had sold a small gold oval locket in that shop, likely within the last few days, and that I needed to buy it back. Sam pulled something up on an old computer, hunting and pecking with 2 fingers, and after a minute he nodded. He remembered the piece. Young woman had come in on a Thursday, wanted an outright sale, not a loan, wanted the cash the same day. My hands were flat against the counter, gripping the edge without my even noticing I'd done it. I asked if it was still there. Sam checked the screen again and said it was still in the case, hadn't moved, and that I was lucky because pieces like that usually sold fast. The relief hit me hard enough that my knees actually went a little weak. Told him I'd pay whatever he'd given her for it. Double if he wanted, just to have it back in my hands. Sam held up a hand and said he'd need to pull the piece and give it a proper look first, that and that. Since it was changing hands again, he was required to run a fresh appraisal on it. He asked me to give him about 20 minutes. I sat down in a plastic chair against the wall while Sam disappeared into a back room with the necklace resting in a small tray. And those 20 minutes stretched out longer, somehow, than the 2 hours I once sat in a hospital waiting room, hearing Louise's diagnosis explained to me for the first time. My phone buzzed twice while I waited. Both times it was Claire, texting like nothing at all had happened between us. She told me she'd landed in Cancun, that the beach was gorgeous, that she wished I could see it. I didn't answer either message. I just sat there, staring at a case of old rings and wristwatches, thinking about how a girl could sell her dead mother's necklace on a Thursday and be sending beach photos by Sunday afternoon like the two things had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Sam came back out eventually, carrying the necklace in a small plastic bag. Just the sight of it again, that little gold oval catching the light under the store's fluorescent bulbs, nearly knocked the wind clean out of me. He set it gently on the counter and told me the original sale had gone for $180 and he could let it go back to me for $250 even. No real markup, since it was clearly a family matter. I could have shaken that man's hand until his arm came off. I had my wallet out before he'd even finished the sentence, and I paid him in cash right there before anything could change. That. He was in the middle of writing up a small receipt when he stopped mid-motion, picked the locket back up, and turned it over slowly in his fingers, squinting at the back of it under the counter light. He made a small sound, almost to himself, and said that was strange. I leaned in and asked what was strange. He turned the pendant sideways and ran his thumb as along a nearly invisible seam I'd never once noticed in 22 years of watching that necklace rest against my wife's collarbone. He looked up at me and asked, slow and careful, whether I'd known the thing opened. I told him no, absolutely not. I'd carried that necklace in my memory for over 2 decades and never once suspected there was a hinge hidden in it anywhere. Sam laid it down on a soft cloth on the counter and worked at the seam with a small metal tool he kept in a drawer behind him, the kind jewelers use on tiny clasps. He explained, while he worked, that some old lockets like this one had a hidden compartment built in. Usually meant for a photograph or a lock of hair, this one had a spring catch, so small it was easy to miss, unless a person was looking hard for it. My heart was going harder than it had gone since that phone call from Claire that morning. After a moment, there was a tiny click, barely audible, and the back of the little pendant popped open on a hinge no wider than a fingernail. Sam went completely still. He looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as careful, the look of a man who wasn't sure how best to say what was coming next. He told me I might want to sit down. I told him I was fine standing. He turned the open locket toward me and folded up inside it, pressed flat against the tiny metal backing, was a piece of paper so thin and so small. I almost didn't believe it could have survived being folded that way for as long as it must have been. Sam used a pair of tweezers to lift it free and unfolded it just enough that I could see there was handwriting on it. Small, careful, unmistakably a woman's hand. My own hands were shaking as I reached out for it. Sam hesitated, only a second before he passed it over, telling me quietly that whatever it was, it looked like somebody had wanted it found by exactly the right person. I didn't open that letter inside the pawn shop. I couldn't. My hands weren't steady enough, and something in me needed privacy for whatever I was about to read. I thanked Sam, shook his hand, and drove home with the necklace and that tiny, folded paper sitting on the passenger seat like they were made of something breakable. Back home, I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Louise and I had shared more meals together than I could ever begin to count, and unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to tear it, because I already had a strong suspicion whose handwriting I was about to find, I was right. At the top, in Louise's small, neat cursive, it read, "To whoever finds this, but really, this is for my Walt." My throat closed up before I'd even gotten to the second line. She must have written it and tucked it into that hidden compartment, sometime in her final year, back when she was still strong enough to sit quietly with her jewelry box and do careful little things like that without my noticing. I sat there a full minute just staring at her handwriting, running my thumb along the ink like it might somehow still be warm. Louise had been gone 3 years, and here she was reaching out from somewhere, saying something to me she'd apparently been holding on to for exactly this moment. Folded up small inside a piece of jewelry neither of us ever imagined would leave this house, let alone end up sitting in a glass case 15 minutes down. Route 20. I took a breath, the kind a man takes before stepping into cold water, and I started reading the rest of what my wife had left for me. She wrote that if I was reading this, it meant the necklace had somehow left our house. That, if she knew herself at all after 28 years, that meant something had happened involving Claire. She said she loved our daughter more than her own life, but that she'd watched her change in the years since the illness set in, and it frightened her. She wrote that she'd seen the way Claire had started looking at things like everything carried a price tag, including the people who loved her. So, she explained, she'd done something about it, back in the spring, about 10 months before she passed, while she still had the strength to leave the house on her own, she'd gone to see an attorney named Arthur Whitfield, whose office sat 3 blocks off Liberty Street near the old hardware store. She'd opened a trust for Claire, using money from a life insurance policy she'd quietly increased 2 years before her diagnosis, money I never knew existed. $52,000, bent for our daughter's future. A house, a wedding, whatever she might need whenever she was finally ready to build a real life for herself. But there was one condition, Louise wrote. Just the one. If that necklace, the one she'd worn nearly every day of her life, ever left our family without my permission, sold, given away, lost through carelessness, the entire trust would redirect automatically to a regional charity called the Lakeview Children's Fund, set up in her name instead. She said she knew that sounded harsh, bad. But she wrote that she needed to know, even after she was gone, whether our daughter valued family more than money, because she'd watched her grow colder about things that used to matter to her, and she'd watched the boy she was seeing encourage every bit of that coldness, and it scared her more some days than the cancer itself did. She apologized for putting this weight on me. She said she trusted me to handle whatever I found the same way she'd trusted me with everything else across nearly 3 decades together. She told me she loved me, and that she'd loved me since the night I'd walked her home from a little diner on Harbour Street and hadn't even tried to kiss her goodnight. She asked me to take care of our girl, even if the truth broke both our hearts a little, before it managed to heal anything at all. I set the letter down on that table and put my head in my hands for a long while. Longer than I'd allowed myself to grieve in months. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I drove over to Arthur Whitfield's office, a small brick building, 3 blocks from the hardware store, exactly where Louise's letter said it would be. Arthur was an older man, somewhere near 65, with a calm, deliberate way of speaking. And when I explained who I was and what I'd found folded inside my late wife's necklace, he didn't look the least bit surprised. He pulled a thick folder out of a locked filing cabinet and set it on the desk between us. He told me Louise had come to see him alone that spring, roughly 10 months before she passed, and that she'd been entirely clear about what she wanted. $52,000 held in trust for Claire, with the exact condition she'd described in her letter. He'd drafted every page of the paperwork himself. Claire had no idea any of it existed. Louise had specifically asked that neither of us be told until the right moment arrived on its own. I sat there, letting that settle over me. Louise had put this all in motion, quietly, carefully, without a single hint to me, back when she was already sick, already dying, already thinking harder about her daughter's character than about her own comfort in her final months. Arthur explained that the condition had triggered the moment the necklace changed hands outside our family. Legally, as of that Thursday afternoon when Claire sold it, the redirect clause was already active. The full $52,000 was scheduled to transfer to the Lakeview Children's Fund within 30 days, unless I, as the named trustee, chose to intervene under a narrow exception written into the 4th section of the trust. I asked him what that exception allowed. He looked at me steadily and told me that if Claire came to genuinely understand what she'd done and made real amends before the 30 days ran out, I had the authority to stop the transfer. The decision belonged entirely to me, not to him. I thought about all of that, the whole drive home, past the hardware store, past Founders Pawn and Loan, past the high school Claire had graduated from 8 years earlier. Part of me wanted to call her right then and lay every bit of it out over the phone, but Louise hadn't written that letter for a phone call. She'd folded it small and hidden it somewhere. It would only surface if something serious happened, and that told me she wanted this handled with real weight behind it, not with anger fired off in the heat of the moment. So instead, I made a plan. I called Louise's older sister, my sister-in-law, Ruth, who lived 2 towns over and had always stayed close with Claire growing up, and asked her to come by for Sunday dinner. I called Arthur and asked whether he'd be willing to attend as well, to lay out the legal details in his own voice, since hearing it from an attorney would carry more weight than hearing it second-hand from a heartbroken father. Then I called Claire. She'd gotten back from Cancun a couple of days earlier, tanned and cheerful, chattering about the resort as though we'd never had the conversation we'd actually had. I told her I wanted a family dinner that Sunday, that her Aunt Ruth would be joining us, and that it mattered. She asked if I was still upset about the necklace. I told her we'd talk about all of it Sunday. I didn't mention Arthur. I didn't mention the letter. I wanted her walking into that dinner exactly the way she'd walked out of our house the previous Thursday, careless and light, because something told me by the end of that evening she wasn't going to feel that way anymore, and I needed her to feel every bit of the distance between those two versions of herself. Sunday dinner started off ordinary enough. Ruth arrived first, hugged Claire tight, and told her how much she favoured Louise when she smiled, which brought a shine to Claire's eyes, though she recovered quickly. Arthur arrived about 20 minutes after that, a folder tucked under his arm, and I watched Claire's smile falter the moment she spotted a stranger in a suit taking a seat at our kitchen table. She looked over at me, clearly rattled, wanting to know what was going on. I waited until everybody had a plate in front of them, though nobody touched their food, before I set Louise's folded letter down on the table where Claire could see it plainly. I told her that her mother had written it and hidden it inside the necklace she'd sold that Thursday. Claire went pale as milk. I read the letter aloud, every word of it, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, even though nothing else in me felt steady at all. When I reached the part about the $52,000 trust, Claire's hand came up over her mouth. When I got to the part about the redirect clause, about the Lakeview Children's Fund, about the 30 days already counting down because of what she'd done, she broke down completely. Not the composed, camera-ready kind of crying. The real kind. She kept saying over and over that she hadn't known, that she swore to God she hadn't known any of it. Arthur spoke next, calm and matter-of-fact, confirming every figure, every date, the fact that legally the money was already on its way out of her reach, unless something changed before the window closed. Claire's phone sat face up on the table where she'd left it. Colton's name lighting up the screen with a message, and something shifted behind her eyes when she looked from the phone back up to the rest of us. Ruth asked, gently, whether Colton knew any of this. Claire shook her head slowly and admitted he'd only known she needed cash in a hurry. She'd never told him why, and he'd never once thought to ask. Her voice cracked completely on that last part. Ruth reached over and rested a hand on her shoulder without adding another word, just letting her sit inside the weight of it. Arthur closed his folder and set it to the side, giving the room a moment before speaking again. He reminded Claire, gently, that the 30 days counted from the date of the sale, which gave her time, not forever. But time. Claire wiped her face and looked at me then, really looked at me, in a way she hadn't managed in almost 3 years. The room went completely quiet after that, nobody touching their food, and I watched my daughter finally take in the full size of what her carelessness had already cost her. The days that followed weren't easy ones for either of us. Claire called Colton that same night to tell him everything that had happened, and by Tuesday he'd gone quiet, stopped, answering her texts altogether, which told me plenty about what he'd actually valued in that relationship all along. Claire showed up at my door Wednesday evening, No makeup, hair pulled back, plain. Looking more like the girl she used to be before her mother got sick than she had in a long time. That. She sat down at the kitchen table and told me she'd spent 3 days replaying every conversation she could remember having with her mother in that last year, palatable and husky male tone, that trying to figure out if there had been signs she'd missed, moments her mother had been quietly watching her, testing her, hoping for something better than what she'd ultimately gotten. She told me she didn't want the money. And I believed her because her voice didn't carry that flat, careless edge anymore. The one she'd used on the phone the morning she told me she'd sold the necklace. She said she wanted to earn it back, not the trust itself. She wanted to earn back the version of herself her mother had believed she could become. I didn't answer her right away. I sat there thinking about Louise's letter, about the exception Arthur had described, about the fact that the entire decision rested on my shoulders alone. Eventually, I told her the truth, that I wasn't going to make this easy on her, that real amends meant real time and real change, showing up for things instead of just talking about showing up. She nodded, wiped her face again, and said she understood. Then she asked, quiet as anything, if she could hold the necklace, just for a minute. I got up and went to the drawer and brought it back to her, and I watched my daughter sit there at that kitchen table, holding her mother's necklace in both hands, crying the kind of tears that come from a person finally understanding something for the first time in their life. I gave Arthur my decision the following week. I told him I wanted to honor the spirit of what Louise intended, not just the letter of it. So we split the difference the way I believe my wife, in her heart, would have wanted it split. That half the trust, $26,000, went to the Lakeview Children's Fund in Louise's name, exactly the way she'd planned if things went wrong. Because something had gone wrong, that and that consequence needed to mean something real, not just get forgiven away without a trace. The other half stayed in trust for Claire, locked until she turns 34 years off yet, with Arthur checking in with me every 6 months on how she's doing, not with money. With showing up, the way Louise always showed up for the people she loved. Claire didn't fight me on any of it. She said it was fair. More than fair, considering. As for the necklace, I didn't put it back in that drawer. I had a jeweler add a small new clasp to the chain so it would close properly around a neck again. And on what would have been Louise's and my 29th wedding anniversary, I gave it to Claire myself, right there at our kitchen table. No lawyers in the room, no letters spread out between us, just the two of us. I told her I believed her mother would want her to have it now, worn, out in the world, not hidden away in a drawer, as long as she understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it had already cost to get here. She put it on, and she hasn't taken it off since. Some nights, late, I still think about how a tiny folded letter, hidden inside a piece of jewelry for 3 years, ended up teaching my daughter more about her mother than I ever managed to say out loud myself in all that time. Louise always did find a way to have the last word, even after she was gone. I suppose some part of me always knew she would.